Hello, everyone. This is a session that we're all greatly looking forward to because of this brilliant mix of writers who have written about cities. We're all familiar with city narratives. In India, we have Bombay narratives as well as Delhi narratives. And the city is a trope that has existed in literature from the very beginning of the city itself. We have modernist trope of the metropolis. We have the postmodern city. We have writers like James Joyce, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot in British literature, as well as in other world literatures, different cities depicted to express the alienation and loneliness and the wandering of the flaneur or the wanderer in the city, and so on and so forth. But the city is not one thing. Even Bombay is not one thing. There are many Bombays, many Delhis. Everybody who lives in that city has a different version of the city, possesses a different meaning of the city. So that is the relevance of the innumerable narratives that come out from one city. These are writers who have themselves lived in many cities. Inevitably, a lot of their life, I'm sure, is there in their writings. And we just got an introduction to all of them. We have a variety of approaches to the city, both positive and negative. Let us start with you, Jeet Thayil, sir. You have the novels Narcopolis and Low, which talk in a very mixed way about the loneliness and alienation and all the negative impact of the city that crushes the individual, plus a sense of repossessing one's identity, a sense of reinventing oneself. In the plethora of city narratives, both modern and postmodern, where do you place yourself? And from there, that point, we can move on to the other writers. And I'm sure it will be a whole tapestry of experiences that emerge from this conversation.
Where do I place myself on the tapestry of city narratives? In the margins, I think. Because, you know, there are city novels, for example, so many novels set in New York, in Bombay as well, that treat the city as a site of transformation, of hope, of glamour, of all these kind of positive things. And I think, especially Indian novels set in cities, you often get the sense that the novels are trying to sell you an idea that isn't exactly accurate, or that kind of glosses over about 80% of the city. It's like an iceberg, and there are certain views that just look at the top of the iceberg and not the rest of it. And the rest of it is the exact opposite of glamour. It is grime. Yes. It's the absence of hope. It's the absence of the ability to transform. It's people who have no chance of rising above their station because of a lack of education or opportunity or money. And at least with Narcopolis, maybe not so much with Low, with Narcopolis, I felt it was a kind of a duty to present that side of the story.
When you talk about when we talk about your narratives, the style in which you have written is such an amazing experience of the city itself. I feel like traveling through the cities, when I go through your sentences, the meandering sentences that sometimes take us nowhere, into an explosion of sensations and meanings. Can you talk to us a little about the style that you have evolved, and especially being a poet and a librettist? There is a fluidity of poetry and music that I see in your narratives, your language.
Thank you. I think there are always two kinds of narratives, and one tells a story. It kind of, you turn the pages. I love those books as well. I read a lot of crime and mystery novels. you're turning the page to find out what happens next. And then there are the other kinds of books where you are stopped by a sentence, and you might reread that sentence, and you might read a few pages and then go back to that sentence or that paragraph and kind of get lost in the ideas and the sensations that those images or even just the language evokes. I've always been partial to the second type of narrative.
And it's obvious. Tejaswini and Doreen they come from another spectrum of city narratives. Their writing is very realistic, and it's about the hardcore realities of the people living in the cities, their struggles for survival. And for us Indians, Bombay is that metropolis, that ultimate symbol of all that the city represents for the world over. Why, Tejaswini, being a person who has lived in many cities of the world, why do you write about Bombay? What makes you come back to Bombay? What is that lure of that city that your work is so full of?
So I've lived in many cities all over the world, but I've never lived in any of them long enough to get to know them extremely well, maybe 2 or 3 years maximum. And I would be very wary of setting any kind of fictional writing in a place where I wasn't completely familiar with the people and the culture. It would feel a bit presumptuous to do that. So I've refrained from doing that. Bombay is a place that's under my skin, in a way, because that's where I grew up. And this particular novel, The Secret of More, it's historical fiction, and so it takes you into a very different kind of Bombay. Almost an origin story of the Bombay that we know today. It starts in 1899 and ends in 1952. And it takes in the textile industry, which was booming at the time, and the beginnings of the silent film industry. And both these have been commercial backbones of the city of Bombay. And they form the city as we know it today. And the other thing that fascinated me about Bombay was that I didn't know enough about my own roots going back within my own family as to how I came to be who I am. And so this novel is very loosely based on my great-grandfather's life, who came to Bombay as a migrant. And he started life in a chawl, sharing a room with 2 other men. And he made his fortune as a selling agent of textiles, then became a financier to Dada Saheb Phalke, and formed the Hindustan Film Company, made over 100 silent feature films, and then became a sugar industrialist. And from starting off life in a chawl, he ended his life in a magnificent sea-facing mansion, pretty much living like a prince. And so I thought this was a great story to take off from. And because I've been moving around the world so much, there was a sense of rootlessness within me. I wanted to know, where do I come from? Because I thought if I don't know where I come from, I don't know who I am. And so when I researched his life, I felt many of the jigsaw pieces falling into place within myself as well. So that there was also that very personal element of writing this novel.
Wow. There are a few connections between Tejaswini's stories. I'm more familiar with your stories and short stories and Doreen's, which you may not be aware of. One is, you talk about urban planning in the title story of your short story collection.
Oh, yeah.
The circuses that sweep through the landscape. How an architect who made all the big buildings in the city is disconcerted because the city is changing. And in one of her short stories, Her Gorgeous Body, you see the city changing because of urban planning. The market where the protagonist works is suddenly demolished and she is homeless. And the second connection between your stories is the recurring motive of clothes, textiles, and body. Very much so in your works. The body as the city itself, the city as a body. I was so fascinated by one line especially. I'm sorry, I have written it here. They swung out of the armpit of Kampala. the Kampala as a masculine body perhaps, and the people swinging out of the armpit. Wow, it was so powerful. So can you tell us more about this urban planning side, Doreen, and how people are displaced and dispossessed, and how you have brought that angle into your, because that's a stark reality of the urban poor who struggle to live there, and why especially you talk about the body. I have seen this in a lot of African works, even African American. The body is a beautiful canvas where you write. Can you please throw light on that?
Thank you very much. Very interesting. In terms of urban planning, our city life in Uganda is really very new, maybe in the last century. Very much a colonial edifice, and the way it was constructed was planned on racial lines. So from the very highest, sort of the 7 hills of Kampala, where the white people stayed, and then there was a buffer around it where the Indians stayed with the shops as well, and where they lived, and then down in the sort of slum areas were the Africans who would come to do sort of the low kinds of labor. So I've always been interested in that sort of layering, and it still exists today, of course, but now up on the mountains are the African elite who have sort of left behind, taken the place of the colonial rulers. And of course, as everybody knows, a larger Indian population were sent away during the time of Idi Amin, which was a horrible crime, I should say that. But I've always been interested in who occupies the city, who belongs to the city, even as it was artificially created. It's the people at the very bottom, economically and literally, who actually build the city. Like one of the highest hills is called Nakasero, which means baskets. They would carry the clay in baskets up to the top of the hill. So in my stories, I prefer the perspective of the lower ones, the ones on the fringe, as you mentioned, transversing. So they're getting out of the armpit. That is like the biggest market, which is a window market. And in this particular story, she's transversing through all the layers and trying to find her way economically. She sells used clothing. And I thought the city as a body, who occupies it, which places in the body, the places like the armpit that smell, that you don't necessarily like, as opposed to the head. And I think it works very well as a metaphor in terms of imagining the place. But it's very much a place that sort of cements the class differences, the class and racial differences.
Yes. Coming back to you both, there is a very common, common factor between your stories is the trope of transformation, change. And I'm particularly fascinated by that feminist Kafkaesque metamorphosis that you wrote, where a man is turning into a beetle. And he was... the man wanted to control his woman and wanted to mentally, he was trying to make her shrink into a beetle, but he turns into a beetle finally. It was beautiful. I'm fascinated by your views on your own techniques of fantasy and disturbing transformations that both of you have used in your works. And that, I think, is the most characteristic feature of your work, sir. Can you please talk about it?
So for my short stories, particularly that one, Homo coleoptera, I took a lot of inspiration from Roald Dahl, his adult short stories. I hadn't really read his children's fiction at the time. And he always gives his villains a real comeuppance, and I loved that about him. And there's always a sting at the end of the tale. So that's where a lot of my inspiration came from for my writing style. And I like I like supernatural stories. I like to write them because you can let your fiction fly in unexpected ways. I think one of the tropes that's running through that particular short story collection, these circuses that sweep through the landscape, is this a sort of an exploration of the dividing line between dark and light, and the fact that it's actually a very small step from here to there. The very small step between sanity and insanity, between darkness and light. And I find that very frightening. I find it very frightening that, in fact, the world as we each know it individually is always very fragile, and it's always on a knife edge. And what's scary is that I think we don't realize it, or we realize it. So this is the scary part. I think we realize it and we suppress it. Yeah. We suppress the knowledge of how fragile everything is, even within our own minds. And so when this man slips into wanting to control his wife, into a weird supernatural kind of thing of actually wanting to shrink her and put her in a glass jar, like one of his beetles, because he's a beetle collector. It's that very small step he takes, almost like just as casually as flicking on a light switch, and that changes the story entirely.
To bring a little more clarity into my question to you, sir, I want you to also reflect on the elements of Baudelaire and...
A request. Could you please not call me sir? Anytime someone says sir to me, I'm looking over my shoulder thinking the police are there. You know, so about to be arrested for something. Call me Jeet, please.
Jeet, the connections that you constantly draw in some of your poems and your writing with Baudelaire, Edgar Allan Poe, there is a whole tradition out there who have written about transformations of the mind and the body. And that is what I have in mind when I ask you to talk about it.
I think probably the transformation that you really can't get away from, that's so inevitable for a writer, is when you know, because even if you've written 5 books, you never actually think of yourself as a writer. And when you are sitting at your desk in front of that blank page or empty screen, it's as nerve-wracking as it was the very first time. And I think something happens at that moment when the first words begin to appear that probably is the most hopeful or interesting transformation that occurs in the life of an artist. And I'm not just talking about writing. I think any kind of art requires kind of a switch in the head, not turning a person into a beetle, but a switch in the head that turns you from a beetle into a human, a creative, thinking, beautiful being that may bring some light into the world, or very possibly more darkness. And I'll just end with since we were on about Kafka, you know, the whole metamorphosis thing. He once said that the artist is like the lamppost shedding light on a dark street in a nameless city, and the critic is the dog that comes and pisses against the lamppost. So I urge you, do not be the dog, be the lamppost.
How much of Bombay is there in your poetry?
I think probably too much. Something occurred to me when you were talking, when you were saying, talking about rootlessness. I heard ruthlessness. And I think it helps to be, I think you have to be ruthless to be rootless.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, because you have to cut off certain roots. You don't see friends and family that you might want to. You have to reinvent yourself, transform yourself every time you go to a new city. Not a bad thing, maybe.
Do you, Tejaswini, I mean, Jeet has been evading that question of mine. He does not place himself in any tradition. Do you place yourself in a tradition of Bombay narratives, Suketu Mehta, Manto, so many people who have written about Bombay. Is there a family of Bombay writers that you belong to?
I don't think so.
It's your
I
Bombay.
never thought about it. I honestly haven't I've never thought about where I fit into the tradition of Bombay novels. But what has come out in various reviews, and which surprised me, was that various reviewers have compared it to Dickens, to the big 19th century novels. And when I read those reviews, I thought, maybe, because it takes in this huge span of a person's life, basically, from youth to old age. And a very detailed cast of characters moving over large areas of the city. It's not all in one part of the city. It really takes in the whole city as it was at the time. So if you want to talk about traditions, I would say, yeah, perhaps the big 19th century novels. And I think maybe at some level I was aware that I was taking on something of that magnitude.
And you are also an environmentalist. You've written about the environment as well. How do you bring your interest in environmentalism into your writing? Because the city is the antithesis of the environment. And does it inform your perspectives on the city? How?
You know, it hasn't at all, not directly. But what really came out when I wrote The Secret of More, the novel, was a sort of an obsession or a preoccupation with the sea, with the marine part of Bombay. And that recurs as a theme in my protagonist, Tatya's life, where it mirrors his ambition, and it mirrors his wanting to go as fast and as far as he can, reflected in the horizon, his eyes pulled up to the vastness of the sky. And for me, that was the pattern that really came up again and again, because I really felt that I was writing about a Bombay that invites risk-taking and it invites ambition.
Yes.
And it often rewards risk-taking and ambition. At the same time, it has the capacity to pull you down into destruction. So there's a kind of a knife edge feeling to the city, kind of a volatility. But that volatility also gives rise to a mingling of ideas, people coming in, a fertility, a crossbreeding of ideas. And I suppose that's the case with most of the great cities of the world, that it's the very volatility that creates a sort of knife edge feeling, and gives rise to great ideas and great endeavors.
That's right. Doreen, I'm interested as an Indian in life in Kampala, and you already mentioned a little bit of it. You have very subtly brought in references to Indians or the absence of them, and the sugar industry, which used to be run by the Indians. What is life like in your city of Kampala? What about the life together with the Indians? Can you throw a little light on it, not as a writer, but as a person from Uganda, who incidentally she's now living in Australia?
Yeah. Well, I think the thing about cities is the bringing in of people from all over, everybody coming from rural areas to come and remake or reinvent themselves in the city. I don't know if how many people know about the history of, I think the coolies who were brought to build the railway. And so it was their descendants, maybe 3, 4, 5 generations of descendants, mostly Gujarati, I think we've been told. And almost all but it was a very deliberate colonial strategy thereafter to make it, to sort of create that kind of business class based on racial lines. So all across the country we have the dukas. I think that's an Indian word. I shouldn't say Indian, it's not a language. Duka is what language? You don't have it in Gujarati?
Duka. No.
A shop. Yeah, so they say that dukawala, or something like that.
Dukan, okay.
Yes, so that's the word in our languages for shop. And all our food is basically, not all, but there's a lot of, maybe a very poor cousin of the curry is what we cook, and you can see this is supposed to be sort of an African thing, but it really isn't. It's much more Indian than African. So it's an interesting sort of, but there wasn't really a mix. People living very, very close with each other, but living very much apart. And I think that was in a sense maybe problematic and led to what happened in the end in 1972. But at the same time, not only in the business, even in the intellectual life, in the struggle for independence, many Indians were involved, especially in Kenya as well, in the Mau Mau struggle. For us, we had, for example, one of the original magazines out of Makerere University. The first editor, the person who started it, was called Rajat Nioji. And so it's so much entwined. And of course, now we have Professor Mahmood Mamdani, who's one of our, greatest professors of Indian ethnicity. If one was to remove, and right now there is a drive to add in the constitution the tribe of, we say, Bayindi. And that's a really big, it's still a struggle. It has not yet gone through. What was your question in particular? I'm rambling. What did you want to know in particular? That's a little bit about the history.
I was talking about how, what is the life like?
It's very different depending on your class. It is you can't really summarize. It's like saying, what's the life like in this city?
Yeah.
It's really, you can't really. But I should say, I've always wondered if the word even of city can be used for towns like ours, where the rural and the urban are still very much entwined. I mean, you could go maybe 3-4 streets and you're already in countryside. And how the mud itself just comes and takes over, and it's very, very hard to keep sort of a separation between urban and rural. I think that's perhaps what's different physically. And but I don't think I can really generalize what life is like in Kampala. It's just a very hectic place. Still not enough mixing as they could be. Because Uganda, for example, now is one of the largest, 4th largest recipient of refugees in the world. So we do have urban refugees from Eritrea, from Ethiopia, from Sudan that add to the cosmopolitanism of the city, but still also lead very sort of in their own community lives.
It is my obsession as a teacher of English literature to talk to everybody about how they place themselves in tradition. I teach English, African literature. I teach writers from Nigeria. I teach writers from South Africa, Zimbabwe, Sudan, Somalia. But we don't teach writers from Uganda. Maybe I will now. I will. In the entirety of African literature, where does Uganda stand? Are there more writers coming up? Are they writing more? Are they diasporic? How do you feel towards the Nigerian authors? Because once I made a YouTube video on African literature, and I talked largely about Nigerian writers and just mentioned the others. Somebody from, I don't even now remember from which country, which is wrong. He just made a very powerful statement against what I've done, saying Nigeria is not Africa. Is there a supremacy of Nigerian writers in the field of literature? Is it difficult for you to make your voice heard?
I mean, in a sense, Nigeria is Africa. The Nigerians say we are all Nigerians. Every 1 in 4 black person is Nigerian. So, of course, just by sheer numbers alone, they're going to dominate in terms of literature. And also, they seem to have had a really good educational system, so that, you have the basics somehow with writing. You really have to start with a good education. They've been able to flourish that way. And I think also with really, this is just my own theory, places with really, really high population, you really have to push to make it. And you have that extra drive. And so, Nigerians are very much on the map. It's also an economic story, because almost everything that happens in terms of culture, it's either Nigeria or South Africa. So it's both the economy and the numbers.
And you share a boundary with Kenya.
Yes. And then then you begin to hear about Kenyans and maybe Ugandans and all the rest of us. But I wouldn't know exactly what tradition. Unfortunately for us, we tend to be categorized again simply because of blackness. You know, I'm an African woman writer. That is supposedly by category, but that doesn't really say much about my style, my interests, the themes I write about. But in that, my interest is exploring women's lives predominantly.
Jeet and Tejaswini mentioned a little bit. We know about Jeet already. How much of them is in their works? How much of you is in your works?
The book Tropical Fish is a collection of short stories that, you know, they always tell us in the beginning, write what you know. So the settings, the places, you know, I grew up in Entebbe. I went to Makerere University. So I have stories in all those settings. In the high school I went to, which was a typical boarding school that I think was all over colonial spaces built on the British tradition. So I have some stories in there. But I think there's less so. I think I just use the material of the place and the people and the kinds of things that would happen. But what happened, where the imagination comes in is in motivation, or the emotional landscape is something that is much more imagined. So a little bit of my life, but not always.
One more question. Bombay for all of us primarily means Bollywood. You have mentioned, you have an element of the movies in your work. Can you expand on that? We talked about the rags to riches story of, what is his name? Tatya.
Yeah.
He moves from the textile industry to the movies.
Yes. So quite a large chunk of my novel takes place in the silent film industry.
Yeah.
And
it's in colonial Bombay.
Yes. So this would have been, so Tatya begins his film studio in 1918, shortly after the war ends, the First World War. And I think it was fascinating for me to go back to that era and see what the pioneers of the industry would have done, because I myself am a movie buff. And so this research was particularly fascinating for me. I think it's easy to forget that not too long ago, people had never seen a picture move.
Yeah.
And the very first moving pictures were shows of, were magic lantern shows, which was essentially a slide projector. And they would move two slides, one on top of each other, so that elements of the scene appeared to move. And silent films came to Bombay pretty quickly after that, after the Lumiere brothers had done their first ever film screening in Paris. And initially, it was very much a sort of a cottage industry, because everything had to be imported. It was very resource intensive.
Yes.
Whether it was the film stock or the editing tools or the cameras, they had to, or makeup had to be imported from Europe or America. And it was that cottage industry beginning that I found really fascinating in terms of things like early film stock wasn't sensitive to a wide spectrum of color. So red was recognized by the camera as black. If you wanted to show clothes that were white, you had to use blue. But green worked very well. So sets were often painted in different shades of green to achieve different gradations of gray tone. So all these things and the beginnings of it, and Tatya is a very conservative character. He falls into filmmaking almost accidentally. When his friend comes to him with this idea, you know, why don't you invest in this new industry? It seems to be a craze, you know, invest in it, get out as fast as you can. And he says, are you nuts? I have a wife and a child. How am I supposed to get involved with these song and dance theater people? So that's his starting point, because it just wasn't considered a good thing to do for a conservative Orthodox family to get into that. But he's essentially a businessman. He senses the business opportunity, he gets into it and becomes wildly successful. But this inherent conflict remains throughout his career as a silent film producer, where his conservative nature finds it very difficult to accept a very different kind of life of theatre artists and cine artists, particularly when there is a switch from, so initially women did not act in films. It was considered a horribly indecent thing for women to do. And so men used to take on the roles of women. They were effeminate men who took on roles of women. But when that switchover comes, you know, that the march of time is such, the changing business environment is such that the switchover from male actors to female actors becomes inevitable, creating a deep conflict within Tatya because of his inherently conservative nature. So this social aspect of it also was very fascinating for me, to see the status of women in early films. And when he hires Kamal Bai, a theatre actress, and that comes with its own set of issues. He finds himself being irresistibly drawn to her, and of course, which clashes with his loyalty and love for his own wife.
Yeah, from the first set of short stories, this historical novel was a big shift. Are you planning to write more historical novels?
I'd like to stay in the same era, I think, because I was. I so enjoyed being immersed in it, and because I did such detailed historical research, I could lead two parallel lives at once, which was very appealing. I could just sort of step through a wormhole and enter this whole other era whenever I wanted to, and I'm unwilling to let go of that too easily. So I might stick with that era.
Jeet, in Narcopolis, we have the transformation of Bombay, represented through the trope of opium becoming heroin. And in Low, you're talking about something related but different. It's grief. How do you choose your themes? It's fascinating. What is, as a writer, we would like to know more about the process of...
I'll say something about something you said earlier about, and you know, every MFA program in the world tells you this, to write what you know. I think that's the worst advice you could give a writer. Because if we were only to write what we know, how boring would literature be? You know, it would be autofiction, and we already know autofiction is fairly unreadable because it never leaves the mind of the person writing the book. And how many pages can you do that, right? Yeah. So certainly Narcopolis was about the transformation of Bombay from a city that in the 70s represented freedom and possibility through the trope of opium, becoming something very grimy. And of course now we know what has happened to Bombay. It's become I think the opposite of the freedom that it promised in the 70s. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. But what interests me more than what happens in the city is the transformation of the central character in that novel.
Yes.
A person who changes from a man to a woman. And sometimes back, depending on what role she is forced to play. Towards the end of the book, she pretends to be a man again. Yeah. And so, you know, if I were to follow that MFA dictum, wouldn't have been able to write that. And of course, also these days you're taking a risk by writing what you don't know, because there will be an army of people waiting on X to take offense at the fact that you have dared to write from the point of view of another gender or another color or another economic bracket, you know. I mean, honestly, how dead would the world be if that's all we created, what we know, and never kind of left that trap? I think the point of reading is to be somewhere you don't know. The point of writing is to write what you don't know, because that's what makes it interesting and exciting, and that's what keeps you enthusiastic about really living like a kind of a monk or a prisoner, sitting in one room for several hours of the day. You know, that's what convicts do.
Let me just respond to that. I agree with you totally. I agree with you totally that it may appear to be very limiting. I think it was something that's used for very beginning writers. At the beginning, when you're finding your voice, when you're, exploring, just learning how to write, sort of a good starting place. But it's not something that I have done. I've been working on a novel about a rebel leader who is a woman in northern Uganda who was a spiritually sort of African Joan of Arc. I should stop using that term. And that is totally different from my own experience. I'm not from northern Uganda. I'm not a spiritual leader. I've never fought in a war. But there's still something that you do get, sort of a foundational place for the leap of your imagination. You're imagining the other through either empathy, but there's always, for me at least, what would I have done in that situation if I was that person, if I was a man, if I was, so I think it's just a technique or a tool to an entry point, but not necessarily an end point.
I'm ready to answer your question. I won't evade it. The reason I took so long, or maybe I was just weighing the wisdom of saying this, is because as a poet and as a novelist who often uses Bombay or cities as a subject, it gives you a kind of a split personality, because the Bombay novelists, certainly of a certain generation, and most of them were men, the people I'm thinking of, Suketha Mehta, Kiran Nagarkar, Cyrus Mistry, several of them, Jerry Pinto. Each of them is an island, right? And these are very strange islands. These are islands that recognize no other islands. They recognize the existence of only one island, and that's their island. Poets aren't like that. The Bombay poets are very different, because I think poets are used to being degraded and kind of suppressed and never having their voice heard very loudly. And so poets aren't arrogant enough to assume that they are islands and no one else belongs on that island. There's a sense of community, a sense of shared injustice, a kind of a bond, between certainly the poets that I knew in Bombay. So maybe that's it's very kind of upsetting in the head, or maybe just mentally challenging to see yourself as a Bombay novelist and a Bombay poet. I wouldn't recommend it. It doesn't make for mental health.
I'm sure people in the audience would like to interact with the writers here.
Hi, I've got a quick question for Tejaswini. I love that your book is already reads like a movie. So my question is, who would play the lead, Sadia, and who would play the glamorous actress that takes his attention away?
It's not something I've thought about too much, but so I assume that if it's going to be made, it should be an epic Bollywood film, right? With all the stops pulled out. And so Tatya should be played by Ranveer Singh. And his daughter Durga should be played by Alia Bhatt. And the irresistible Kamal Bai should be played by Taapsee Pannu. Yes, Ranveer Kapoor is my, But they're similar age, so yes, playing father and daughter would be weird, but I'm just playing fantasy football, so.
Sir, my question is to Thayil. Yes. I belong to your native place, that's your father's Tumbaman. I am a writer, Tumbaman Thangapan. I would like to know about our native place. Have you got any experience with the Tumbaman, or have you any plan to write about Kerala, creative writing or other writing? Have you got any idea?
I've visited there very often when I was young, not Tumbon, I mean, not so much in the last decade or so. But the book I'm currently working on, which is a kind of it reads like a memoir or a story about a family, but it's actually a novel. Yeah, it is. Yeah, and in fact, there are real names in it as well. So that is about Kerala. It's set in parts of Alappuzha and parts of Thumbon. And some members of the family appear in their own names, but doing and saying things they would never imagine doing or saying in real life. And I think when it's published, there might be some objections.
Hello, sir. I think, I mean, since we're talking about cities, and this question is for like all three of you guys. You know, have you ever wondered about like the end of a city, or like how a city might die? Like you know, like we all know like Mumbai and Delhi and you know all these are like very big cities, but I think bigger cities have like existed in history and they've all died. But so have you ever thought about that in your literature? Like how, if Mumbai is going to end, like how is that going to happen, and what's going to happen after that?
So that's, I think that might win the prize for best question of the day. I'm just going by intuition. I think Bombay will end, like the Frost poem, will it end in fire or ice? I think Bombay will end in fire. And you see that conflagration occurring periodically in Bombay. Something sets off a spark that then sets off a fire that then sets off a riot that lasts for months and takes so many lives. It's a kind of a powder keg, really, that city. And if it isn't fire, it's going to be water. As the ice caps melt, all those multi-million-dollar sea-facing apartments, you won't be able to give them away because the water is going to swallow them up. It's going to be like a scene out of that Spielberg movie set in the future when the world is covered in water and you just see the top of the Statue of Liberty, the torch, you know. And
so if Jeet is going to write a dystopian novel, we know where the ideas come from.
Can I respond to that also? I love that question. I think it's a great question. So my response to that would be that Bombay has already ended several times, because there are different... Bombay, as it was 100 years ago, as it appears in my novel, for example, simply doesn't exist anymore in terms of the landscape and in terms of the, I guess, the mindset or the political, social environment, or even the business environment. For example, the mills at one time, the textile mills were absolutely a commercial backbone of Bombay. It's hard to overstate how important they were. It was the largest employer of labor at the time. And in the early 20th century, the spinning and weaving capacity of Bombay was 50% of that of all of India. So it's hard to overstate that. And now, of course, the mills have ended. That whole culture has ended. The kinds of migrants that those particular mills brought in, employed, all the politics that was generated out of that, all that has ended. But there's a transition, because those mills have now turned into malls. It's a different city, and yet the same. So I think there are so many endings. And I think I hope that comes out a bit in my novel, where I end my novel just when Bombay is about to have its first, India is in the middle of having its very first election. And that's where my novel ends. And I hope that comes out, that even within the 5-decade span of my novel, such a rapid transition from tradition to modernity, many Bombays ended and then began again.
I think I'll also answer that really quickly. I think it would also be underwater. Kampala will end up underwater, but only in marsh, not really the ocean, because it was built, there are these hills, but most of the area now was hills above wetland. So there are many areas that were not supposed to be built on, that are protected wetlands connected to Lake Victoria, but because of corruption and so on and so forth, people just build on the wetlands. So I imagine with climate change, there's going to come a time when, you know, with all the rains and the floodings, right now Kampala floods a lot. It will all be, you know, life underwater, but not in the sea, but in a marshy kind of. So I might have to write science fiction. this is to my friend who was talking about science fiction. Another thing could be war. I have a feeling there's always been a tension between the original, not occupiers of the land, the original settlers who are the Baganda, for whom the whole country was named after, but it's because it's the capital, people come from all over, and they've always been talking about chasing us out. That's sort of the former federal system, and chase the rest of us out. So that may just happen where, God knows, I wouldn't want to imagine the carnage, but it wouldn't end happily.
I have a question for Doreen. Doreen, you are located in Australia at the moment, and your earlier discussion seemed to me to touch on this idea of authenticity. You know, write what you know, write your own place, right? But you are distant, and also even when you were not distant, you were writing in very, I think, innovative ways. And so I wonder if you can tell us what distance does to your writing, and also what your theory of writing is coming from a distance.
Yeah, when I wrote Tropical Fish, I was living in the United States, so I was already distant, and so there's always that element of nostalgia, which I think was also mentioned, but also the distance gives you a kind of perspective where you sort of can step out of things and see things a little bit clearer. Ability to think it through and actually turn what is just lived life into words. But then I went back home for 15 years, and my writing was different, because then I didn't have to imagine the smells and the sounds and the birds singing and the language. And I think the writing became, if there is such a thing as authenticity, which I always question, because I don't really think that exists. I think there is what we are supposed to be, whether it is, you know, authentically African or authentically my ethnicity group, which, as we really know, is a myth. There are different myths that we create around authenticity. And I think when I was away, I was much more concerned about the authenticity, because I was living as a minority somewhere else. When I was actually in my own space, it was not an issue, because I was very much aware of how much we are part of the global space. Now that I am in Australia, mostly working on a memoir, so I'm really going to the past. And I just feel as if I don't actually exist in Australia. I feel a sense of disassociation. It's just a place where I sleep and I eat, but mentally and emotionally, or maybe because it's too soon, I am not there. So it's kind of science fiction-y as well. I don't know if that answers the question directly, but sometimes a place is just utilitarian. It's a place where you can eat and sleep, but then your real place is in the mind, in the land of the imagination.
Thank you, audience, for your participation.